How can a man with billions in the bank be powerless to save his own son? Edward Coleman roared, slamming his fists against the cold hospital wall as his boy lay motionless inside. Across from him, a trembling little girl wiped dirt from her face, whispering, "I didn't want him to be alone." That single sentence shattered everything Edward thought he knew about strength. What do you feel in this moment? Anger, sorrow, or hope? Tell me below. The phone rang. It was not his assistant's polite extension, not the scheduled tone of an investor. It was urgent, sharp, rung a sound that didn't belong in Edward Coleman's carefully ordered world. He answered with the calm authority of a man who believed there was no problem too great for him to solve. Coleman. But what came instead wasn't efficiency, it was fear. "Mr. Coleman, your son. He's on the street. He's not moving." The voice was trembling, small, fragile, barely more than a whisper. For a second, Edward thought he had misheard. A prank, surely. But then came the sobs, cracked and raw with honesty. "Your son, Michael. He fell down. He won't wake up. Please, you have to come." Edward froze. His hand locked around the receiver until his knuckles turned bone white. His mind rebelled, rejecting the words, but images came anyway, Michael chasing a soccer ball, laughing under the sun-blue eyes, bright with mischief. Michael tugging on his sleeve, waiting for bedtime stories, Edward too often cut short for business calls. Michael's small hand curling into his own on long walks through the garden. And now, his boy on the pavement eyes closed a stranger's voice begging him to hurry. "What street?" Edward's voice cracked. Near Millennium Park, the girl stammered. That was all it took. The empire he had built, steel towers, contracts, billions, collapsed in an instant. The office that had once been the symbol of his control now felt like a coffin. The floor-to-ceiling windows normally opening to a glittering skyline pressed against him like prison walls. His lungs ached for air. The world that had always obeyed him suddenly slipped beyond reach. Edward shoved his chair back so hard it toppled the crash, echoing across glass walls. Papers scattered like worthless confetti contracts fluttering to the carpet. The untouched espresso cooled on his desk. Quarterly projections blurred into meaningless lines. None of it mattered. Not anymore. He lunged for his coat, fumbling with trembling hands, and bolted for the elevator. His assistant's startled voice followed him down the corridor, but he didn't hear. The only sound that mattered was the thundering of his own heartbeat drowning out reason. Inside the elevator, he pressed his palm against the steel wall, whispering his son's name over and over like a prayer. When the doors slid open, he was already running. The driver of his black sedan barely had time to react before Edward flung himself into the back seat. His voice, usually calm and measured, came out in a ragged command. "Millennium Park. Drive." The sedan lurched forward, tires screaming as it shot into the chaos of the downtown traffic. Through the tinted glass, the city he had ruled for decades no longer glittered with triumph. It was a maze, cruel and indifferent, designed only to delay him. Every red light was an insult. Every car in his way, an enemy. Pedestrians drifted across crosswalks too slowly. Horns blared, engines roared. But all Edward saw was distance. Distance between him and his son. Distance he wanted to rip apart with his bare hands. He leaned forward, fists clenched, body taut, as if sheer force of will could drag the car faster. He had once believed he could bend the world to his command. Today, trapped in traffic, he felt powerless for the first time in his life. Memories slashed through him like knives. Michael laughing as waves washed over sand castles on the shore of Lake Michigan. Michael's delighted squeals as Edward pushed him higher and higher on the backyard swing. Then, darker memories, the bedtime story cut short by a vibrating phone, the way Michael had whispered, "It's okay." Dad, though, his eyes had betrayed quiet hurt. Each memory was a blade carving deeper into his chest. What good was an empire if he couldn't protect the one life that gave it meaning? Faster, Edward barked, his voice breaking. The driver swerved, tires shrieking in protest, horns erupting from every direction. Edward didn't care. His mind raced ahead, painting unbearable images, his boy lying still on the cold pavement, strangers stepping around him, his small body swallowed by the city's indifference. His breath came ragged. He pressed his palms together, whispering bargains to a god he hadn't prayed to in years. If only his boy was still breathing, he would give up anything. Everything. Minutes stretched into centuries. The city blurred into streaks of steel and concrete. Edward could feel sweat gathering at his temples, sliding down his collar. His throat ached with the weight of unspoken cries. He had negotiated billion-dollar deals without flinching, but today, every second was an enemy he couldn't defeat. Finally, the sedan screeched to a halt at the edge of Millennium Park. Edward flung the door open before the wheels stopped turning. His polished shoes slammed against the pavement, his coat snapping like broken wings in the wind. He ran. Past startled pedestrians, past the glow of phones already raised, past voices whispering. Is that him? None of it mattered. His lungs burned. His breath came in ragged gasps, but he didn't stop. Up ahead, he saw the crowd, a cluster of strangers gathered on the curb, murmuring, pointing, recording. Somewhere inside that circle was his son. The thought froze him mid-stride, terror clawing at his chest. Edward Coleman, the man who had mastered chaos, who commanded empires, who bent markets to his will, had no plan. No power, no guarantee. He was running blind into the unknown. The only thing keeping his legs moving was the fragile, desperate hope that when he reached his boy, Michael would still be breathing. Edward's shoes pounded against the pavement as he sprinted toward the cluster of people gathered near the curb. The late afternoon light stretched long shadows across the park, the golden glow bouncing off the glass towers around Millennium Park. He shoved through the crowd without a word, his chest burning, his breath ragged. Then he saw him. Michael. His little boy was lying motionless on the concrete, his chestnut hair ruffled his small frame, frighteningly still. His light shirt was wrinkled and streaked with dust, and the sight froze Edward where he stood. Time seemed to collapse. The city noise faded, replaced by the deafening rush of blood in his ears. He had seen markets crash, contracts collapse, entire industries crumble, but nothing had ever dismantled him the way that small, fragile body on the pavement did. His knees hit the ground so hard he barely noticed the sting as concrete ripped into the fabric of his tailored suit. The man who had once towered over boardrooms was now face to face with helplessness, trembling as he reached for his son's cheek. Beside Michael knelt a little girl, no more than 7 years old, her blonde hair tangled into uneven strands, her denim jacket smeared with dirt. She had tears streaked across her face, but her eyes were steady, fixed on the boy. Her small hands hovered above Michael's chest, uncertain, as though she wanted to help but didn't know how. Edward's gaze flicked toward her, a stranger in the middle of his worst nightmare. She looked up at him, and for an instant he saw both terror and courage in her wide blue eyes. I didn't know what else to do. She whispered, her voice shaking. He fell down. He wouldn't wake up. Edward swallowed hard, fighting the panic that threatened to choke him. He bent low, pressing his ear close to Michael's lips, desperate for any sign of life. There it was, faint, shallow breathing. Relief hit him like a wave, but it was thin, fleeting, fragile. His hands shook as he brushed the hair from his son's forehead, whispering his name as if the sound alone could pull him back. The little girl shifted beside him. I tried, she stammered. I remembered something from TV. I put him on his side for a while, but I didn't know if it was right. Her small shoulders trembled under the weight of responsibility far too heavy for her age. Edward's throat tightened. You stayed," he murmured, his voice hoarse. "You didn't leave him alone." Sirens wailed in the distance, faint at first, then swelling until they echoed off the steel and glass around them. Edward clung to the sound as if it were a rope thrown down into the pit of his fear. Around him, strangers lingered, their phones raised, some recording, some whispering. He caught a glimpse of the glow of a camera trained on him, but he didn't care. He was a man stripped bare of image and status. He only cared about the shallow rise and fall of his son's chest. One man in the crowd called out, "Is he breathing?" Edward ignored him. His world had narrowed to the boy before him and the little girl who hadn't run away. He wrapped one trembling hand around Michael's and squeezed. "I'm here," he whispered fiercely. "Daddy's here." The sirens grew louder until red and blue lights spilled across the pavement. An ambulance skidded to a stop, doors flinging open as paramedics rushed forward with practiced urgency. They dropped to their knees, voices calm and clipped, issuing orders Edward could hardly comprehend. One checked Michael's pulse, another fitted a small oxygen mask over his face. The sight of that mask swallowing his son's features nearly broke Edward. "Please," Edward rasped, his voice cracking as he looked up at the paramedic. "Please save him. He's my only boy. Sir, we need space." One of them said firmly, guiding Edward back a few steps. The rejection landed like a physical blow. Every instinct screamed at him to fight, to stay close, to protect. But reason, thin, fragile, told him these strangers were his son's only chance. The little girl had retreated a few inches, but not left. She stood behind Edward, her denim jacket slipping off one shoulder, her fists clenched at her sides. She looked so small in the chaos of the moment, yet she hadn't run, hadn't abandoned the boy she didn't even know. Edward turned to her, and in her trembling frame he saw something that steadied him, a reminder that courage could exist even in the smallest, most fragile bodies. "What's your name?" he asked her, his voice unsteady. "Sophie," she whispered, blinking hard as if holding back fresh tears. "I didn't know what to do, but I couldn't just walk away." The name branded itself into his memory in that instant. He would never forget it. Without her, Michael might have lain here alone, unseen, too late. That thought shook Edward more than anything else. The crowd pressed closer, murmuring, snapping photos, but the paramedics formed a shield around the boy. "We've got him," one said. "He's still with us." The stretcher was rolled out, straps and buckles snapping into place. Michael's small body looked swallowed by the equipment, dwarfed by the urgency surrounding him. Edward stumbled forward, reaching for his son's hand, even as they lifted the stretcher. His voice cracked as he whispered, "Hold on, Michael. Hold on." Tears blurred his vision, hot and uncontrollable. For a man who had spent decades mastering the art of restraint, it was the first time he couldn't contain the flood. Sophie stood just behind him, her eyes wide as she watched the scene unfold. She pressed her palms together tightly, lips moving in a silent prayer. Edward caught it out of the corner of his eye, and the sight lodged deep in his chest. A child praying for his son, when all his billions could do nothing. He would never forget that either. The stretcher slid into the back of the ambulance machines, already humming, oxygen flowing. Edward climbed in without hesitation, ignoring the orderly who tried to block him. He wouldn't be separated from his boy, not now. As he gripped the rail beside Michael, he felt a small tug at his sleeve. Sophie was standing at the edge of the door, her face pale, her eyes pleading. Edward bent down, his voice breaking. "You saved him from being alone. Thank you." Her lips quivered. "Please don't let him die." The doors slammed shut, cutting off the sound of the crowd, the glare of lights, the whispers of strangers. Inside, it was only the roar of the siren, the clipped voices of the paramedics, the faint beeping of monitors and the fragile thread of life tethering Edward's son to the world. He gripped Michael's small hand, whispered promises, bargains, anything that rose in the storm of fear. For the first time in his life, Edward Coleman understood what true helplessness meant. He had conquered markets, steered corporations, bent circumstances to his will. But here in the back of an ambulance speeding through the streets of Chicago, all he could do was hold on to his son and pray that fate would give him one more chance. The ambulance doors flew open beneath the harsh glow of hospital floodlights. Edward followed the stretcher as it was wheeled inside his heart, hammering against his ribs. The sterile corridors of Northwestern Memorial swallowed them, the white walls, and the chemical scent of disinfectant pressing in from every side. Nurses and doctors called out orders, machines beeped in rapid rhythm, but all Edward saw was his son's pale face under the oxygen mask. When they reached the emergency ward, a nurse blocked his path firm, but not unkind. "You'll need to wait here, sir." Edward's mouth opened to protest, but his voice caught. He looked past her at the doors swinging shut at the glimpse of Michael's small frame vanishing into the sterile light. His chest felt crushed under the weight of helplessness. All his life he had been the man with answers, the man who moved the world by sheer force of will. Yet, in this moment, he was nothing more than a father locked outside begging silently for mercy. He sank into one of the hard chairs in the waiting room, his head in his hands. His suit was wrinkled, his tie askew, his body trembling from adrenaline that had nowhere to go. Around him, other families whispered, cried, prayed. He had always thought of hospitals as places for other people, ordinary lives he brushed past. Now he was one of them. A small movement caught his eye. Sophie had followed him inside, still clutching the straps of her denim jacket. She looked impossibly small against the vast walls, her hair tangled her face, blotched with dried tears. She hovered near him, uncertain, then slid into the chair beside him. She didn't speak at first. Instead, she pulled something from her pocket, a crumpled piece of paper and a stub of a pencil. She bent over it, tongue caught between her teeth in concentration, and began to draw. Edward watched in silence, unable to look away. After several minutes, she pushed the paper toward him. It was a child's sketch of a boy with bright eyes standing in the middle of a garden. Michael. Above his head, Sophie had drawn a sun with bold, hopeful rays. "This is him when he gets better," she said softly, her voice trembling but steady enough to reach him. Edward felt something break inside his chest. He knotted his throat too tight to form words. He folded the paper carefully and slipped it into his pocket as though it were more precious than any contract he had ever signed. As the hours stretched, Sophie told him bits of her story in fragments. She lived with her grandmother in a small apartment on the south side. Her parents were gone, and her grandmother often worked nights, leaving her to walk home alone from school. She had been passing through the park when she saw Michael collapse. Fear had clawed at her, but she had remembered a flyer she once saw with Edward's company logo and number. "I thought maybe, if I called, someone would care," she whispered. Edward turned to her astonished by the simplicity of her faith. A child had gambled on the slim chance that a man she had never met would answer. And now, here they were, bound by her desperate courage. Time passed in slow agony. Edward's phone buzzed constantly in his pocket, calls from his assistant, messages from board members, even an alert about a press leak that the CEO had abandoned an emergency meeting. He silenced them all. His empire, once the measure of every hour of his life, meant nothing. He was tethered only to the thin thread of hope behind those double doors. Late into the night, a doctor finally emerged. Edward leapt to his feet, his heart in his throat. The man's voice was calm, measured each word, chosen with care. "Your son is stable. He's under observation. We need to keep monitoring, but for now, he's holding on." Relief swept through Edward so sharply it almost buckled his knees. He gripped the doctor's arm, whispering, "Thank you," though the words felt pitifully small. He was allowed to see Michael for a few minutes. The room was quiet except for the steady beeping of monitors. His boy lay still, his chest rising and falling with the aid of machines. Edward sat beside the bed, reached for his hand and whispered his name over and over, as if the repetition might anchor him here in this world. Sophie hovered near the doorway, hesitant. Edward beckoned her closer, and she tiptoed to the bedside. She stood on tiptoe, peering at the boy she had helped keep from being alone. Her eyes shimmered with both fear and wonder. Edward saw it the way she carried herself a child, yet already bearing the weight of responsibility no child should ever know. In that sterile room under the hum of machines, Edward felt the hollow shell of his old life fall away. He had spent decades mastering wealth and power, but none of it had prepared him for this sitting beside a fragile boy who meant everything, and a little girl whose courage had already changed them both. When a nurse gently ushered them out again, Edward returned to the waiting room, Sophie at his side. She curled up in a chair, clutching her jacket like a blanket, her small body trembling with exhaustion. Within minutes, she was asleep, her head resting against the armrest, her hair spilling across her face. Edward watched her for a long time, something stirring in him he couldn't quite name. Gratitude, protection, a fierce determination that she too would not be left alone. As the night deepened, he leaned back in his chair, eyes fixed on the closed doors down the hall. His life had never felt smaller yet, never more real. He whispered into the silence a vow that rose unbidden from the depths of his chest. If he wakes up, I will change everything. The monitors continued their steady rhythm beyond the wall, a fragile lifeline holding his world together. Edward sat in the stillness, waiting the weight of regret and hope pressing equally on his chest. Beside him, Sophie stirred in her sleep, a child who had unknowingly become his anchor. For the first time, he realized he wasn't just waiting for his son. He was waiting to become the man both children already needed him to be. Morning crept into the hospital room in thin shafts of light that cut through the blinds and spilled across the floor. Edward sat where he had sat for nights now, slumped in a stiff chair pulled close to Michael's bed. His face was lined with exhaustion. His shirt wrinkled, his tie discarded hours ago. He hadn't left except to pace the hall or splash water on his face in the restroom. Every hour felt like a negotiation with fate. Every breath his son took with the help of machines, both a relief and a torment. Sophie was on the floor nearby, her small legs crossed her denim jacket, wrapped around her like a blanket. She was bent over a piece of paper again, crayons scattered in a colorful mess around her. Edward had grown used to the sound of her quiet scratching pencil, the way she filled the room with color when words failed. This time, she was drawing Michael holding a kite. The sky around him shaded bright blue. She didn't look up as she worked, but every so often her eyes flicked to the boy in the bed, as if willing him to open his eyes. Edward rubbed his hands over his face, then leaned forward, resting his elbows on the edge of the bed. He whispered his son's name, his voice breaking under the weight of it. And then it happened so small at first, he thought he imagined it. Michael's fingers twitched. A curl against the blanket, almost nothing but enough to make Edward's breath catch in his throat. Michael. His voice cracked as he sat bolt upright, clutching the small hand in both of his. The boy's chest rose with a deeper breath than the machine had given him. His eyelids fluttered. The room spun for Edward, disbelief and hope, colliding with such force that tears blurred his vision. Sophie's crayons clattered to the floor as she scrambled to her feet. He moved, she cried, her voice shrill with wonder. Edward bent low, his forehead nearly touching the bed rail. "Son, it's Dad. I'm here. Open your eyes." And then, like the smallest miracle Michael did, his eyelids lifted just enough to reveal dazed, glassy blue eyes. His lips parted, and in a whisper so faint it almost disappeared into the hum of the monitors, he said, "Dad." Edward broke. A sound burst from him that was half sob, half laugh, his body shaking as tears fell freely onto his son's hand. "I'm here," he whispered again and again, kissing Michael's fingers, gripping them, as though holding on could keep him anchored to the world. Sophie stood beside the bed, her hands pressed to her chest, tears streaming down her cheeks. For a moment, she looked as if she belonged as much to the moment as Edward did. Her small shoulders quivered with relief, and when Michael's gaze slid toward her, his lips trembled in something like recognition, though he was too weak to speak. Doctors and nurses rushed in voices brisk and clinical as they checked vitals and adjusted machines. Edward barely heard them. All that mattered was that his boy's eyes were open, that the fragile spark of life had not gone out. When the medical staff finally stepped back, murmuring cautious optimism, Edward remained rooted to the chair, his hand still gripping Michael's. In the hours that followed, Michael drifted in and out of shallow sleep, but each time he stirred, Edward was there, speaking softly, promising things he had never promised before. He told him about all the places they would go together when he was stronger, about soccer games and campfires by the lake. He whispered apologies, too. Apologies for missed dinners, for bedtime stories cut short, for every moment he had chosen work over being present. He vowed aloud that it would never happen again. Sophie hovered close through it all, her presence quiet but steady. She fetched water for Edward, straightened the blanket at the foot of the bed, and slipped more drawings onto the nightstand. Each picture was a little brighter than the last, Michael riding a bike, the three of them sitting together in a park, a house with the sun overhead. Edward began to notice how often she looked at him with a flicker of fear beneath her courage, as if bracing for the moment she would no longer be needed. One evening, when Michael had fallen back asleep, Sophie sat in the chair opposite Edward, her knees drawn up to her chest. She hesitated before speaking, her voice so soft he almost missed it. "When he's better, you won't need me anymore, will you?" Edward leaned forward, startled. "Sophie, look at me." She did her eyes wide and uncertain. "You are the reason my son isn't alone tonight. You are part of this now. Don't ever think you don't matter." Her lips trembled, and for the first time since he met her, she allowed herself to lean into him. He wrapped an arm around her narrow shoulders, feeling how fragile she was under the denim jacket. She didn't say another word, but her small body relaxed against his side, and Edward realized with a clarity that stunned him. He wasn't just protecting his son anymore. He was protecting her too. The world outside the hospital continued to move, but for Edward, everything had narrowed to this room, to the two children who had become the center of his universe. His empire could wait. The calls could go unanswered. The deals could collapse. For the first time in his life, he no longer cared. He had been handed something infinitely more valuable, the chance to be the man his son needed, and the man a little girl had believed he could be. Late one night, as Edward dozed lightly in the chair, he woke to find Sophie standing at the window looking out at the city lights. She didn't turn when she spoke. "People don't usually stay," she said, almost like she was speaking to herself. Edward rose and crossed the room, standing beside her. "I'm not going anywhere," he said quietly. She glanced at him, then her eyes shining with something between doubt and hope. He held her gaze. "Not from Michael, not from you, I promise." In the silence that followed, the promise hung heavier than any oath he had ever made in a boardroom. It was a promise of presence, of commitment, of something that couldn't be measured in money or power. Behind them, Michael stirred in his sleep, his breathing steadier than it had been in days. Sophie pressed her forehead against the glass, a small smile tugging at her lips for the first time since he had met her. Edward rested a hand lightly on her shoulder. He had no words left, only the conviction that whatever came next, they would face it together. In that fragile, luminous space between fear and hope, Edward Coleman understood that his life had already changed forever. The awakening of his son was not just the return of what he almost lost. It was the beginning of a bond, one that tied him not only to the boy in the bed, but also to the girl who had refused to walk away. The weeks after Michael's awakening passed with a quiet rhythm that felt like rebirth. The sterile white walls of the hospital gave way to the familiar warmth of home, and Edward found himself relearning how to live in the presence of his son's laughter. Each day, Michael grew a little stronger. The first time he sat up unassisted, Edward's chest swelled with pride so fierce it left him speechless. When Michael managed to walk a few shaky steps across the living room, Edward felt as though he were watching a miracle unfold before his eyes. Every smile, every word, every sound of his boy's voice was no longer ordinary. It was treasure. Yet Edward's gaze often wandered beyond his son to Sophie. She had become a constant in their lives, moving quietly through the house like she had always belonged there. At first, she hovered at the edges, hesitant to accept the comfort offered to her. When Edward set a plate before her at the dinner table, she would wait until he encouraged her twice before she touched it. When he left a blanket on the couch, she curled up with it, but only after looking around, as if expecting someone to tell her it wasn't hers. It broke Edward's heart to see how deeply she carried the weight of being unwanted. Michael, however, refused to let her retreat. He tugged her into games, pulled her to sit beside him at meals, and shared his toys with the kind of certainty that children carry in their bones. To him, Sophie was already his sister. Edward watched this bond grow between them, a connection that seemed both effortless and destined. One evening, long after Michael had fallen asleep with a toy car clutched in his hand, Edward found Sophie curled on the couch in the living room. The fire flickered in the hearth, painting her face in warm light. She was wrapped tightly in a blanket, her knees drawn up, her eyes fixed on the flames. Edward sat down beside her without speaking at first. The silence stretched comfortably between them until her voice, small and trembling, broke it. "I've never really known what it feels like to be safe," she whispered. "My grandma's house. It's just a place to sleep. I don't think she'd notice if I didn't come back." Her eyes glistened, but she didn't look away from the fire. "Sometimes I wonder if I mattered to anyone at all." Edward's chest tightened, as though someone had gripped it in both hands. He turned to her, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "You matter," he said firmly. "You matter more than you know. You saved my son. You changed everything. And I won't let you go back to feeling like you don't belong." The words came not from impulse, but from the deepest conviction he had ever felt. In that moment, Edward knew what he had to do. He began the process of adoption, facing the paperwork and the hearings with a determination that rivaled any business deal he had ever fought for. But this wasn't about contracts or strategy. This was about giving a little girl the one thing she had never known, a home. When he told Sophie what he intended, her eyes widened with disbelief. "You mean, you want me for real?" Her voice was so fragile it nearly broke him. Edward knelt before her, his hands resting lightly on her shoulders. "Not just want you, I am certain. You are my daughter as much as Michael is my son. This is your home now." The day the adoption became official, Sophie held the papers in her hands as though they might vanish if she blinked. Tears rolled silently down her cheeks, but her smile, tentative at first, then radiant, was one Edward would never forget. The mansion that had once echoed with silence now rang with the sound of two children chasing each other through its halls. Their laughter bounced off the high ceilings, filled the garden, and spilled into Edward's office, where once only the hum of business had lived. For years, he had guarded his empire of glass and steel as if it were the most important thing in the world. Now, standing in the backyard on a clear spring day watching Michael and Sophie chase each other across the grass, he knew better. His true empire was here running barefoot in the sunlight, their joy more valuable than all the numbers on his balance sheets. Edward joined them on the lawn, his suit jacket discarded. His shoes kicked off the earth solid beneath him. Michael collapsed in the grass, laughing breathlessly, while Sophie flopped down beside him, her blonde hair tumbling into her face. Edward lowered himself between them, pulling them close, one small head resting against each shoulder. The three of them formed a circle of warmth that no loss, no storm, no fear could ever undo. He closed his eyes, inhaled the scent of new blossoms drifting on the breeze, and thought of how close he had come to losing everything. He remembered the call from a trembling voice, the sight of his son on the pavement the long nights by the hospital bed, and the moment when Sophie had chosen to stay instead of walk away. Gratitude surged through him, fierce and unshakable. For the rest of his life, Edward Coleman would measure wealth not in dollars, not in skyscrapers, but in the two small hands he now held. He had been given a second chance, and he vowed he would never waste it. Edward Coleman's life had been built on skyscrapers, contracts, and numbers that stretched into the billions. For decades, he believed power was measured by what he owned and who he could command. Yet, in a single phone call, all of that collapsed. The trembling voice of a child told him his son was lying unconscious on a cold Chicago street, and in that instant, every deal, every title, every possession meant nothing. He was stripped of everything but the raw truth. He was a father desperate not to lose the boy who gave his life meaning. From the pavement where his son lay to the long nights in a sterile hospital room, Edward faced helplessness for the first time. But in that darkness, light came from an unexpected place, a little girl named Sophie, who chose not to walk away. Her courage to stay to call and to hope created a bond that neither money nor influence could have forged. As Michael fought his way back to life, Edward discovered that the strength he once thought came from wealth was shallow compared to the strength found in love, vulnerability, and connection. When Michael's eyes finally opened, Edward was reborn alongside him. He vowed never again to measure his worth by markets or towers of steel, but by the lives he held closest. And when Sophie's quiet truth emerged that she had never truly known safety or belonging, Edward chose to redefine his family. Through adoption, he gave her what she had never had, and in return she gave him something far greater, the reminder that true wealth lies not in possessions, but in the bonds we create when we open our hearts. This story is more than the transformation of a man. It's a mirror for us all. How often do we chase the next accomplishment, the next milestone, while missing the fragile, priceless moments right in front of us? Edward's journey teaches us that our empires, whatever they may be, are hollow without love anchoring them. The lesson is simple but profound. Slow down, be present, and recognize the people who give your life its true value. It may not be billions in the bank, but it will be the kind of wealth that endures long after money fades. If this story touched you, take a moment to reflect on what family, love, and courage mean in your life. And if you'd like to join me in sharing more stories that remind us of the power of human connection, please subscribe to this channel. Your support gives me the motivation to keep creating meaningful content for you.